So I think along the way in my journey on looking to politics and talking with a lot of people, especially on the street, as I like to go out and drink coffee and talk with others to see what they're thinking, I see a lot of misconceptions about a lot of things. So to begin with, I think we need to define certain terms. In the West, words like socialism, communism is more or less scary to people, so to say. And capitalism is something that they embrace. But often when I ask them, but what is it exactly that scares you? And please use terms from socialist or communist literature, then they have no answer. And can you maybe define it kind of for us? So there's a clear, conscious definition of capitalism, socialism, and communism to help the viewers to understand what exactly what is what, because a lot of people are extremely confused. I think also in the United States, I know so in the United States because I talk with Americans a lot, but it's similar in my country, and it seems a lot of times that they are very, very confused on what is happening to them. They blame it on something which is not. So maybe you could explain it because you're way better educated on it than me.
Yeah, this is such an important question, and we have to understand that miseducation comes from somewhere. I'm um, I'm a follower of Aristotle's dictum that he makes at the beginning of his Metaphysics, which is that all men by nature desire to know. I think if people were given the proper opportunities, they would like to know, what is the system that I live under? What alternatives have there been historically? But there's an intentionality to keeping them ignorant, to keeping them smart enough to continue being cogs of the machine, to be smart enough to be good subjects of consumption when they leave the workplace and go to the shopping mall and purchase things on their credit cards because their wages don't extend that far, but dumb enough to not question the system. And now there's all these modern mechanisms like social media that literally destroy your attention span. And guess what? To think systematically, you need an attention span because you need to be able to concentrate at a very deep level when you're thinking about something as complex as a system. So this ignorance is intentional. It's part of how capitalism itself is reproduced. When I speak about the difference between these systems, especially with my students, which teaching in the United States, even at a university setting, which is the setting in which I teach, you get to see in these individuals, especially I've been doing it for like 7 years now, how much the educational system is failing because they get here, and even the word capitalism, they don't even know what it means. At least before they had wrongful presumptions about what it was. 7 years ago, I asked, "What do you think capitalism is?" And they'd say like markets or something. Today, they don't even know how to use words to formulate an answer to very basic questions. So this is how I break it down. Capitalism is a form of life. It's not just a way of aligning yourself. People go around saying, I'm a capitalist. Well, where's your capital, right? Where's your capital? You don't really have any. Capitalism is a form of life. It's a moment of world history where the series of social relations, the relations between groups that reproduce society, drastically change from what existed before. It develops out of Europe and out of European feudalism, which is defined by a completely different set of relations and class antagonisms, primarily those between the feudal lords and the bondsmen or the serfs, right? There was a different type of relationship, and the serfs were exploited, but the way in which they were exploited was almost totally different. They would produce their harvest, they would own their own means of production, and they had their access to the land. The form of property that the Lord had was a specific form of property, which meant shepherding the land and ensuring that everyone within the land is cared for. It's not the jus utendi et abutendi logic of property that we get with capitalism, which is the right to use and abuse. The lords of the land had a responsibility to their serfs, and the serfs would produce what they could, and then they would give a portion to it to the lords. And they understood that this tax in kind was a form of exploitation because a part of their work was given to the Lord. All of this begins to change with the development of capitalism. at the beginning, you have this process called primitive accumulation. That's how it's described by the original theorist of capitalism. Marx calls it the so-called process of primitive accumulation because they always obfuscate what actually happened. What Marx shows, I think, quite convincingly in the first volume of Capital that actually happened to get started this system of capitalism is that these common lands that everyone had access to in order to produce the things that they needed to survive with their own individualized means of production, they were enclosed, they were privatized. And now all of these large swaths of common lands that people used in order to survive, in order to obtain their means of subsistence, now they belonged to a private capitalist who employed laborers through wages, sometimes even indentured servants, and sometimes even slaves in some parts of Europe, in order to work the land to produce whatever commodity brought about the most profit. And here is where I think the key of what capitalism is to be found. Not just because we have primitive accumulation still today, that's not necessarily the case, but because capitalism is signified by a change in the what the Greeks called the telos, the purpose, the goal of society. Feudal society had a very clear purpose. It was to reproduce that aristocratic ruling class. They weren't trying to continue expanding and get richer and richer. They were already rich and they liked their luxury and they wanted to sustain their luxury, but they didn't have this ideology of just expansion, expansion, expansion. Capitalism introduces a new logic into society that becomes dominant. That's why it becomes capitalism, even though there's capital before in other societies. And it's dominated by the fact that capital itself is not a thing, it's a specific type of relation that things come into when the purpose of production is accumulating capital. To translate it into terms that, people might understand more, when the purpose becomes profit, when the purpose of producing, for instance, a water bottle is not to satisfy people's thirst, um, when the purpose is quite literally just making profit, that's when you have the logic of capital operative because the thing becomes not just a commodity, it becomes a specific type of commodity called capital. And when society comes to be ruled in general by that logic of capital accumulation, that's when you have a capitalist society. And over time, all of the institutions, whether it's the governmental institutions, the specific ones that are tied to the state, or the judicature, or the educational system, or the cultural industry, or even the healthcare system, over time, all of these institutions, some of which are specifically developed within capitalism, uh, end up functioning for the larger purpose of capitalism, which is capital accumulation. So if you're an American and you want to understand why is it that the healthcare system is not really a healthcare system, it's just a system of profit where there's no attempts to actually prevent sickness because they profit from sickness. There's no real substantial attempt to cure it in ways that are not just band-aid treatments that lead to more treatment further on. Why? Because it's based on profit, right? The same thing with education. What receives the most funding in universities? It's the departments that lead to the sort of people that eventually are able to donate a lot of money to the school, or it's the activities like sports that make the school money. The philosophy departments get funding? No, in fact, it gets drastically cut because what the hell does the school care about like critical thinkers or something like that? So it's a logic that literally infests everything in culture. Why does it feel like every single Netflix movie that we watch it's just literally the same script with maybe some
Yeah.
different variables. It's because that's the formula that has led to profit in the past, and they don't want to change it because they're investing a lot of money to make these films. Why is there war? I mean, now everyone is pretty clear that the US doesn't get involved in the so called Middle East and West Asia just for the sake of bringing democracy and human rights and all these things. It's very clear that
Yeah.
they get involved for resource grabs, control over assets, and for defending the basic infrastructure of empire. That is the highest form that this capitalist system has been able to attain. So, a very simple definition of capitalism, it's a society in which the essence of everything in society becomes the accumulation of capital. The purpose of everything becomes the accumulation of capital. And therefore, the capitalist class, as Marx put it, I think very correctly in his book on the capitalist mode of production, in his Capital, the first volume. The capitalist class is just the personification of that movement of capital. They are the agents that, in a certain sense, are also enslaved to capital because they're enslaved to that process of accumulating capital. Now, what is socialism? Socialism is conceived of within the Marxist tradition, specifically Marx's conception of socialism, as the historical stage that comes after capitalism, which is defined generally by what we call a dictatorship of the proletariat, which means that the instruments of the state, the instruments of political power are transferred over to the working class, or in the case of China, the working class and the peasantry. That's a novel development that Mao brings to Marxist theory, that it doesn't have to be the working class. It could be other popular, or what Gramsci called subaltern sectors of society. And now they have dictatorial power, which means they get to enforce their collective interests over society. And you can have still a capitalist class, as China does, but they're subservient to the larger interest of society. That's what's called the dictatorship of the proletariat. In the Marxist theory, it's conceived of as an intermediary stage, um, that has to sustain the existence of this very new type of a state, which is a state that, instead of being an instrument of a small group of people who own property to repress the interests of the people that are forced to work in order to make money for them, it's a state that represents the whole of society, or the vast majority of society, which is the working class. Why is it necessary to sustain a state as an apparatus of dictatorship? Well, quite simply because society doesn't just completely break off globally when you have a socialist revolution like in 1917 or 1949 with the establishment of the PRC. You still have internal elements that want to bring back the old order. Uh, that's what's called in our tradition reactionaries. And then you also have the reality of imperialism that is going to collaborate every step of the way with those internal reactionary elements. And the only way you can combat that is by having a strong, efficient state that has taken the security mechanisms, the security procedures necessary to ward off imperialism. This is why, some time ago, when what happened in Venezuela, kidnapping of Maduro, I was really pleased to see that online a lot of people were sharing pictures of Kim Jong Un, saying this person is sleeping peacefully. He's not getting kidnapped. Why? Because he has nuclear weapons. And
Yeah.
ideally, none of us would want a world with nuclear weapons, with weapons of mass destruction of that nature, but it's the reality that imperialism forces upon anyone who breaks themselves off from that logic of capitalism and is now forced to defend itself from imperialism. And communism, theoretically, for the Marxist tradition, is what happens when, after many generations or hundreds of years, all of those threats, which made it necessary for the working class in power to sustain a dictatorial state, to ward off imperialism, internal enemies, when they start to fade away, and I don't know, let's say the US as the imperial hegemon falls under the control of the American Communist Party and is no longer an empire and is now itself a working class socialist republic. And then the whole world begins to have these socialist transformations at the level of their countries and civilizations. Well, ideally, it gets to a point where the state itself, as a mechanism of repression against these reactionary elements, becomes superfluous because you no longer have those reactionary elements, and you can have the state not as a political entity, just the administrative functions that occur outside of the realm of politics, because politics is understood in Marxism as specifically how it is that contradictory classes um, engage in disputes with each other. So communism is that ideal society that all who call themselves communists are also fighting for, which is a society without class exploitation, without some of the basic forms of alienation that are intensified with capitalism, without the mediation of money in order to get things, and without the state as a political entity. There will still be, of course, administrative functions that are carried out by society, and where there's such an abundance that people just have, free time. And Marx calls this the kingdom of freedom. Now, there's that understanding of the different forms of life to describe capitalism, socialism, and communism, but in a very practical and political sense. Uh, it's interesting because a lot of the people that call themselves socialists, they're not identifying with that historical lineage. They call themselves socialists precisely because they don't want to identify with what's called the tradition of 20th and 21st century communism. They don't want to identify with the Bolshevik Revolution, with the USSR, with China, with Cuba, the DPRK, Vietnam, Laos, etc. All of these countries that had socialist transformations that were led by a communist party. So in political lingo, I call myself a communist and not a socialist because the people that call themselves a socialist reject that tradition of 20th century communism, while the people that call themselves communists or that talk about China or the USSR as communist states, it's not because they achieved a communist form of life fully, but because they're led by a communist party and are functioning as the real movement of history that's moving history along beyond the stage of capitalist imperialism, which is also how Marx and Engels come to think of communism. This is why it gets a little bit complicated because they're philosophers and they're using the same word, communism, in different senses. It's both the movement of history carrying things forward, such that when the capitalist class overthrew the feudal lords, they're technically functioning as that communist world spirit moving history forward. But it's also that remote form of life, the communist form of life, and it's also what they called lower communism, which eventually just gets called socialism, which is that intermediary period of the dictatorship of the proletariat. So, in short, that's what I would say. Capitalism, society that works for capital; socialism, a society that works for society itself, and that still has to engage in disputes with global capitalism and defend itself. And communism, a society where those antagonisms have been resolved and a lot of the basic mechanisms that constitute class society can just fall apart and you just have this kingdom of freedom, as Marx called it.